Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong says ASEAN remains relevant, with the bloc able to come up with substantive agreements, collaborations and policies which will help member countries. And he says that the group is doing many things to maintain that relevance, update its agenda and enhance cooperation. Mr. Lee was speaking to the media at the end of the ASEAN summit and related meetings today. Saiful Bahri Ismail with this report.
ASEAN and world leaders involved in this week's summit in Jakarta were treated to a gala dinner. It was a welcome break for the leaders amid discussions on serious issues affecting the region. One issue is how to maintain ASEAN's relevance. Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong pointed to the vision for ASEAN 2045, which is a long-term plan on what the bloc wants to achieve in its next phase. He also noted achievements made on the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, or AOIP. It lays out the bloc's common position on regional cooperation, security and prosperity, as well as its stance on not taking sides with any major powers competing for influence in the region.
You don't have single, spectacular, sexy things, but you have multiple, patient, positive things. And by accumulating all this patient work, ASEAN makes a difference and has made a big difference to the Southeast Asian countries. Without ASEAN, there would not be a forum where you would have the American leaders, the Japanese leaders, the Chinese, the Indians, the Australians, the Koreans, the New Zealanders, Americans and Russians. But because there is ASEAN, every year we have this forum and it's very valuable to us.
Another issue that weighed heavily on the agenda was the Myanmar political crisis. ASEAN leaders have agreed to set up a troika mechanism comprising the immediate past, current and incoming chairs of the regional bloc to tackle the crisis in Myanmar. The Philippines is also set to replace Myanmar as ASEAN chair in 2026. Mr. Lee said ASEAN's review of its peace plan on Myanmar is useful by helping the bloc manage the issue better, but will not solve the situation in the country.
But we do want to engage the parties in Myanmar. We would like to encourage them, nudge them in a constructive direction, to encourage them to talk to one another and to work out a solution which will work for Myanmar. And by having this established as being the current chair, the previous chair, and the next chair, you have a grouping which exists, which has a certain continuity and renewal as the chairmanship moves on every year. And I think they will work together as a group and together will engage the parties. I imagine that instead of they could divide up their work, but I think more likely the three of them will work as one collective group, and they will engage the parties in Myanmar.
The ASEAN Troika is expected to consist of Indonesia, Laos and Malaysia. Analysts had previously criticized the yearly replacement of the ASEAN Special Envoy on Myanmar as inconsistent and counterproductive. However, they believe the Troika mechanism is a good idea as it enables the continuity of programs and ensures countries can work together on issues, especially in trying to resolve the Myanmar crisis. In a ceremony at the end of the ASEAN summit, the bloc's outgoing chairman, Indonesia, handed over the mantle to Laos, who will lead the bloc next year. Saiful Bahri Ismail, CNA, Jakarta.
Our Prime Minister Lee spoke of Singapore on the sidelines of the ASEAN summit, saying the city-state will not be entering a recession this year. He added that ASEAN's economy is also proving a bright spot in the global context, with 4% growth expected this year.
Singapore's growth is a little bit slower because we are more at the developed economy rate of growth. And even in a normal year, in a good year, we'd be talking about 2.5%, 3% would be a very, very good year. The rebound from COVID was different. I mean, that's transient, it's not sustainable. So for us, 1% is slow, but it's not a recession. And we'll have to see how things go in Europe, in America, and also in China.
Still, the Prime Minister thinks there is some sluggishness in Singapore's economy. Within ASEAN, resource sectors like natural oil and gas are set to fluctuate. There could also be weaknesses in traditional sectors, depending on mood. These include tourism and retail. Mr. Lee says the bloc is doing what it can.
I think there could be weakness depending on the mood. So I wouldn't worry too much about the transients. I think what you need to do is to enhance our capabilities and our competitiveness and our cooperation so that whatever the environment, we can do better for our peoples. And that's what ASEAN is trying to do.
Singapore has urged members of the East Asia Summit, or EAS, to use their influence to get the Myanmar military to fully implement the five-point consensus. Now, the five-point consensus is ASEAN's peace plan to resolve the political crisis in Myanmar. The EAS is one of several meetings Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong attended at the ASEAN summit in Jakarta. Speaking at the EAS, Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong urged partners to work with ASEAN and support the bloc's efforts to stop the violence, facilitate humanitarian assistance, and engage all stakeholders in Myanmar. The EAS consists of the 10 ASEAN members and other participating countries such as China, Russia and India. Mr. Lee said that it's more important than ever to redouble efforts to strengthen the EAS as a platform for strategic dialogue and cooperation. Now, over at the ASEAN-India summit, Mr. Lee says that India's support is crucial in addressing the issue of Myanmar and other common challenges. He said ASEAN's external partners and Myanmar's neighbours have important roles working with ASEAN to facilitate national reconciliation. India was represented by Prime Minister Narendra Modi at the meeting. Mr. Lee said that ASEAN and India must also press on with economic integration and collaborate in emerging areas. And these include deploying renewable and low-carbon energy to address climate change. At the ASEAN-Australia summit, Mr. Lee said Australia's contributions have been an important factor in ensuring the security and stability of the region. He added that Australia's firm commitment to the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, or AOIP, signals its continued support for the bloc's centrality. The AOIP lays out the bloc's common position on regional cooperation, security and prosperity, as well as its stance on not taking sides with any major powers competing for influence in the region. Mr. Lee said that ASEAN and Australia should work on tangible projects under the AOIP to further underpin and strengthen Australia's role. And he added that Singapore looks forward to commemorating 50 years of dialogue relations next March with Australia.
Our PM Lee also met South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol on the sidelines of the ASEAN summit. The Prime Minister's office said both had a fruitful discussion on ways to further collaboration between the two countries, including in areas such as trade and the digital and green economies. The leaders also exchanged views on regional and international developments. They looked forward to the 50th anniversary of diplomatic relations in 2025. Mr. Yoon extended an invitation to Mr. Lee to visit South Korea. Mr. Lee also invited Mr. Yoon to visit Singapore next year.